Father Charles Nicholas Boz has been a priest for 15 years, and he is both a Ph.D. student and a faculty member at Antiochian House of Studies, and he is also on the OAS and OASJ committee. He holds a Bachelor's of Science from Central Michigan University and an MDiv from St. Vladimir's Seminary. In 2010, he published the Archdiocese Book of the Epistles and Orthodox Lectionary. He has delivered several lectures and retreats on the Orthodox faith in several parishes and also online. Father Charles, over many years, has accumulated his expertise in the sacred scriptures, the church fathers, and church history. The title of his presentation is Education as Emancipation, Orthodox Pedagogy as a Catalyst for Resilience under the 18th Century Ottoman Rule. Father Charles.
Thank you, Azizi, for a beautiful introduction. I want to thank my brothers and fathers before me, Father Christian, Father Giovinali, for the Cosmin, for a beautiful symposium. I want to thank Father Michel and Father Fadi, my teachers, for their patience, allowing me to present for a fourth time here on OAS Symposia, and for allowing us to use PowerPoint. This is the first time we use PowerPoint, which makes our presentations a little bit more interactive. So my topic today is very important. It's about the 18th century. It's about education as emancipation. I want you to pay attention to the title, Education as Emancipation. What Orthodox pedagogy did as a catalyst for resilience under the 18th century Ottoman rule. It's a very pivotal century in the history of the church. So we need to be aware of it to understand what's really going on, because a lot of the things that we have today in the 21st century, 3 centuries after, are really precipitations of what happened in the 18th century. So in this presentation, with God as being our helper, I would like to give a quick survey of the Turkish Ottoman rule, the empire in the 18th century, the living conditions of our people, the Orthodox Christians, then the state of Orthodox Christian education, the Orthodox Christian revival that happened in the 18th century specifically, which turned out to be in the most part as an Orthodox response to the teachings in the West. The rise of the Kollyvades movement, which I don't think many are privy to the Kollyvades movement. It was a catalyst for Orthodox revival in the second half of the 18th century. I want to touch on specific saints and theologians. The Holy Hieromartyr and Is Apostolos, equal to the apostles Cosmas, Aetolos, and Saint Macarius Notaras. He was the Metropolitan of Corinth. And the third person was a significant Orthodox theologian by the name of Nikephoros Theotokis, served as Archbishop of Astrakhan and Stavropolis in the Russian Empire. Now, in the 18th century, with the exception of Imperial Russia, all Orthodox nations were under the Ottomans, either fully or in part. You could see that in the map that I'm showing you. The green is an overlay over current geographies. The Ottomans, basically, with the fall of Constantinople, took over all of what the East Roman, known as Byzantine Empire, was: North Africa, the Middle East, and what later on became known as Turkey, as well as Greece and the Balkans. In the 18th century, the ancient and apostolic patriarchates of Alexandria, Antioch, and Jerusalem were controlled and governed by the Greek Phanariots. The Greek Phanariots were opportunists. They were wealthy Greek merchants from a suburb of Constantinople, and they were translators because the IQ of the Turks was lower than average. They needed to communicate with the Europeans. And so they were opportunists in the sense that the Phanariots were their translators, and they climbed up the echelon and gained the confidence of the Ottomans and the Sultan. And they did some bad things, unfortunately. The autocephaly of the Orthodox churches of Serbia in 1766 and Bulgaria in 1767 were stripped by the Patriarch of Constantinople and mainly by the actions of the Phanariots. The Melkite schism of Antioch in 1724 resulted also in the Phanariot Greek control of the Church of Antioch until 1898, the election of Meletius Domani. Even the mainland and island Greeks resented the Phanariots. Thus, the Orthodox Church was captive in the 18th century. Now, what was the condition of Orthodox Christians since 1453? We were to understand ourselves, my people, as defeated peoples, as conquered nations, and as subdued faith. The Muslims, the Turks, the Ottomans considered us as people of the book, which I think is a huge misnomer, because Christianity existed before the scriptures were published in decades, and as well as our distant cousins, the Jews. For many centuries, the faith existed in ancient Israel before the writing of the scriptures took place. In reality, with all due respect, the Protestants could be classified as people of the book, because that's how they believe. Everything is Bible-based, as well as the Muslims. The Muslims are the people of the book because of the Quran. If you need proof of that, just burn a Quran in public and you will see the reaction. So the Orthodox people under the Turks were termed as Roum Millet, the Roum nation, which I agree with that. I have no problem calling myself Roum Orthodox. Anyone who is Romanian, Serbian, Bulgarian, Greek, Russian, what have you, we have no problem calling ourselves Roum Millet because we belong to the Roman Christian Christ-loving emperor, the last of which was killed, Constantine the 11th Palaiologos, in 1453. The anniversary, sadly, was yesterday, May 29th, 1453. However, a dark precipitant of the Turkish rule was the Millet Pasha, in the sense that since we no longer have a Roman Christian emperor with the Symphonia introduced by Emperor Justinian I of the 6th century, the eagle with the two heads, where one head rules the state, the other head rules the church. This Symphonia of Justinian was destroyed, and it brought nothing but utter catastrophe to the Orthodox Church, because we know from the teachings in the Gospels and we know from the canons of the church that the clergyman ought not to be involved in any secular duty, as well as, more importantly, government position. Yet the Patriarch of Constantinople became the Ethnarchis, the Ethnarch, the head of all the Christians, and this destroyed the integrity of our Orthodox identity for over 1,000 years when Constantinople was our capital. Christians are considered Dhimmi. According to Muslims, Dhimmi means that you have to pay a jizya tax. It's a punishment. Muslims claim that it is to protect the Christians who are not allowed to serve in the military. They have to pay the tax, but in reality, as my ancestors have taught me, this was our right of existence. You don't pay that, you were severely punished. A new reality entered with the fall of Constantinople and with the Ottomans taking over. That Sharia law was enforced. For those who are not privy to the laws of Islam, Sharia laws dictate that anyone who is not a Muslim is a second-class citizen. Our people for centuries had to submit to a Muslim sultan. So in the 18th century, the Balkans, the Serbs, Bulgarians, Romanians, Albanians, others, as well as Arabic-speaking, my people, Orthodox, as well as Greeks from the mainland Greece and the islands were resentful of the Turkish-controlled Patriarch and the Phanariots in Constantinople. Here I have a mosaic which unfortunately the Patriarch of Constantinople takes pride in. This is a depiction of Sultan Mehmet II, who conquered Constantinople, with an image with Gennadios Scholarius, who allowed his election in 1454, symbolically giving the rights with the Greek inscription eso patriarchis echon pandata pronomia to pro esu, which basically saying you have the rights of your predecessors, which is nothing but a lie, unfortunately. Now, outside of the Turkokratia, former Byzantine Empire, things were better because there are two foci when dealing with Orthodoxy at the period when you read history books. There is Constantinople and there is Moscow. Because in 1700, Peter I, who is known as the Great, I call him Peter not so great, he refuses to appoint a successor to Adrian, the Patriarch of Moscow, and therefore he dismantles the Patriarchate of Constantinople, and this happened for 217 years until 1917 with the election of Saint Tikhon, the confessor, who was formerly in America, that once again there was a patriarch in all Rus. In 1721, we know from history books that Peter wanted Russia to be Western. So he created in 1721, 4 years before he died, the Holy Governing Synod. It's known as a spiritual college. Peter declares himself imperator, more than a tsar. He directly controls the church through an Ober Procurator. The first vice president of the Holy Governing Synod was Feofan Prokovovich. He was Western educated, and he establishes a Protestant Lutheran model for the state-controlled church in all of Russia. So the Russian church also becomes a government agency, a bureaucracy, controlled directly by the Romanovs from 1700 until 1917. Western Europe, the situation was not that much better, because America relates a lot, our beloved country. We're celebrating the 250th independence. However, whether we like it or not, the so-called American founding fathers, as well as the Western Europeans, were all deists. They believed in deism. The others were Freemasons. And so deism, as we see specifically in the French Revolution, from 1789 to 1799, it was against the church. It dismantled the power and authority of the Roman Catholic Church. So I have images of Peter the not so great in the bottom, as well as an image of our people who were enslaved by the Turks. These are children, Christian Orthodox children, sold as slaves by the Sultan who is sitting there. And Europe was obsessed with the age of reason. The ultimate victim of all this was the education of our people. The educational system under Turkokratia, unfortunately, was fragmented. It was organized within the Millet system, and only those who had the means, the affluent, could receive higher education. So they had to go to the West, to Europe, and that exacerbated the problem. If you look at Theophan Prokopovich, he's an interesting character. He's Ukrainian. He abandons Orthodoxy, becomes a Catholic in order to receive education in Kiev, Poland, and Rome in St. Athanasius's Academy, and then goes and studies in the University of Halle in Germany. And therefore, in his capacity, the government, the administration of the Orthodox Church in Imperial Russia came to be known as a Protestantized Caesaropapism. Petro Mohila was a good man. I don't have anything negative to say against him. He had good intentions. However, because he studied in Lviv, in Poland, and in France, and in the Netherlands, according to the assessment of the ever memorable Father George Florovsky, the two major works of Peter Mohila, who was Metropolitan of Kiev in the 17th century, are Latinizations. They are severely polluted with Latin forms of theology. Cyril Lucaris, as well, who studied in Venice, Wittenberg, and Geneva, and at the Austro Academy in Poland, Lithuania, then, unfortunately, is known as the Calvinist Patriarch of Constantinople. He is contemporaneous with Peter Mohila. The worst one was Cyril Tannas, Cyril the Sixth, who was born in Damascus in 1680. He studied 8 years at the Collegium Urbanum de Propaganda Fide in Rome. So he was literally brainwashed. He was a unionist. He was elected as Patriarch of Antioch in 1723 and caused the painful schism in Antioch of those who called themselves Melkite, stealing even the title from us because we are the Melkites. We belong to the Roman Christ-loving king who was stationed in Constantinople. So all the clergy under Turkokratia, regardless of their nationality, were regarded as Greek clergy. And they lacked formal education in the 18th century. Most of those who came from Western Europe and visited our lands, they saw them as illiterate, they saw them as corrupt, they saw them as backwards and as vulgar. To make the situation worse, in 1740, Latin becomes the primary academic language in Orthodox seminaries across Imperial Russia because of what Peter wanted to do by making Russia more European. Pure and undefiled Orthodoxy in the 18th century, despite all the bad things that happened, existed in the last bastion in the Orthodox monasteries around the world. In Antioch, Jerusalem, Athos, Greece, the Balkans, Constantinople, and Imperial Russia, most of the saints of this specific century, they came from monastic circles. I am surprised to know that a lot of people don't know much about the Kollyvades movement. This is an icon of the saints from the Kollyvades movement, which came about in the second half of the 19th century. Those were people who wanted to go back to the basics of orthodoxy. They saw what's happening. They saw our people going to the West and learning things that are not coherent or consistent with orthodoxy. And they were specifically against innovation. And the Kollyvades movement were persecuted. There was a lot of tension on Mount Athos. If you look at the center front, there is Saint Makarios Notaras. He is considered as the catalyst of the Kollyvades movement. Next to him is Saint Nicodemus, the Agorite. On the extreme left, you see Saint Athanasios Parios, who was ordained a priest by Makarios, and he wrote down the life of Saint Makarios Notaras. Behind him, in the second row to the left, is Saint Cosmas Eitolos, and next to him is Saint Paisios Velichkovsky, who is also significant in starting the Staretsdom, the Starets movement in Russia, because of his translation of the Philokalia and the Optina revival in there. So the Kollyvades, unfortunately, were condemned on two councils, on Athos and Constantinople, and they were the problem was partially resolved by Patriarch Gregory V in 1819. So what did the Kollyvades movement stand for? Strict adherence to the Typikon, emphasis on the Orthodox tradition, and this is the most important part, compilation and study of the patristic texts of the Holy Fathers. They revived the hesychasm and the ascesis associated with the phronema and the ethos of the Orthodox Church. When Fathers Florovsky and Romanidis talk about the Philocalic revival, it was started 2 centuries before them by the Kollyvades movement. Because of their struggle on Athos, which was probably a good thing, many of them had to leave Athos. They went to Greece, the islands, the Balkans, the Middle East, and they created a renaissance in Orthodox spirituality. I want to touch on 3 figures from the 18th century, which I think they were foundational. They are called the Daskali to Genus. They are teachers of the race, teachers of the nation in modern Greek history. The first is Saint Cosmas Aetolos. The second one is Saint Macarius of Corinth. Both of those two on the left are saints. Both of them were part of the Kollyvades movement. Nikiforos Theotokis is someone who is not very much well known unless you read Greek or Slavonic or Arabic, which I will get to later. But he's also foundational. Even though he was not on Athos, he was monastic. There are common denominators among those 3 essential figures from the 18th century. All of them, they called for Orthodox spiritual revival. They emphasized the revival of the Philocalic nipsis through tradition, patristic studies, and frequent Holy Communion, which I will get to later on, because communion was not taken as we take it for granted in our days. I will talk about that later. They're all rooted in the ascetic traditions. Cosmas and Macarius were on Athos. Nikiforos was in a monastery in Corfu where he was born. They emphasized preaching, educational activism, repentance, and confession. All 3 fought against assimilation to Islamic and Western influences. If we look at Saint Cosmas Aetolos, he was born as Kostas in 1714 to devout parents in Megadendron, which means the great tree. He studied at the Ethonite Academy near Vatopedi on Athos. The Ethonite Academy was the school that prepared people for the priesthood. It was like a seminary. Later, he spent 17 years at the Philotheiou monastery. When he was tonsured the monk, his name changed to Cosmas, and he was ordained a priest. He was characterized by his care for the others. He saw the destitute situation of our people under the Turks. In 1760, he felt the calling to educate and enlighten the Christians. In Constantinople, he was appointed to be the preacher of the nation by Patriarch Seraphim II. From 1760 until his martyrdom on August 24th, 1779, Saint Cosmas traveled throughout the Greek mainland, the Dodecanese and the Ionian Islands, and the Balkans, South Serbia, but mainly in Albania, preaching and establishing schools. He founded 200 elementary schools and 10 high schools. He traveled on foot from village to village, requesting in advance a cross and a podium in front of the cross so that he could stand and teach and preach. He secured donations towards 4,000 baptismal fonts in Greece and Albania. Now you kind of wonder, why would he need that? Well, this is what Turkokratia did to us. When they destroyed our churches and turned most of them to mosques, in the original churches, they had the baptistry built out of stone inside the church. So this is a custom that goes back to Turkokratia of having a separate baptismal font, because Christians under Turkokratia were not allowed to build churches. St. Cosmas did not leave us any treatises or theological works. Only some of his letters and sermons have survived. He was accused to be a Russian spy, and the Turks hung him to death, and they threw his body in the river. A monk by the name of Papa Marcos found his incorrupt body 3 days later and laid it to rest at the entrance of the Theotokos monastery near Kollyvades, which is in Albania. This is a picture or an icon depicting how Saint Cosmas traveled and taught the people. I like the title in Greek, O Agios Cosmas o Etolos Didaskontus Sklavomeno Yenus, the Holy Cosmas Etolos, teaching the enslaved race. That's why those Christians, they look like Turks with those mustaches and those outfits, but those are Christians learning about their faith, which was abandoned because of Turkokratia. Some of the sayings of Saint Cosmas are worth of mention. You could see in the first quote that I'm going to tell you that he is directly criticizing the religion of Islam, which does not have a favorable view of women. You know, from the inheritance law of Islam, the woman receives 1/8 of the inheritance because she is subhuman. So what does Saint Cosmas teach to wake up the people in Christianity? He says, God created woman equal with man and not inferior. My Christian, you must love your wife as your companion, not consider her as your slave, for she is a creature of God just as you are. God was crucified for her as much as for you. You call God Father, she calls him Father too. Both of you have the same faith, the same baptism, the same book of the gospel, the same Holy Communion, the same paradise to enjoy. God does not regard her as inferior to you. It's hard to read the scroll in the icon in his hand, but that's also an important criticism of Islam that Saint Cosmas directed. He says in there, God is called light, life, and resurrection, but his chief name is love, because in Islam, love, as we understand it in Christianity, as our Lord taught us, they don't know what love is. The relationship between humans and God is the relationship of a slave towards his master. And then I like his version of the Jesus prayer. He has a specific version which I really like by Saint Cosmas, who, by the way, is called Patrokosmas by the Greeks. They love him so much they consider him the father of the modern Greek nation, Father Cosmas. This prayer should never be absent from you, he says. Lord Jesus Christ, Son and Logos of the living God, through the Theotokos and all the saints, have mercy upon me, thy sinful and unworthy servant. Saint Cosmas says, always say this prayer, both with your mouth and with your nous, with your mind, day and night, wherever you may be, whether eating, walking, working, or sitting, always meditate on it, as it benefits you a great deal. It frees you here from every evil, delivers you there from eternal hell, and renders you worthy of going to paradise, our heavenly country. He was pragmatic, because listen to what he teaches. We leave aside, he says, my brethren, the prattling of the impious, the heretics, and the atheists, and say only what the Holy Spirit has illumined the holy prophets, apostles, and fathers of the church to write. There's an interesting quote by St. Cosmas. He says, The Holy Spirit illumined firstly the holy prophets, and they wrote the divine scriptures for us. Secondly, he illumined the holy apostles. And thirdly, he illumined the holy fathers. And they, the holy fathers, have explained the books of our church in order that we may know how to conduct ourselves. If you wish to be saved, he says, seek no other thing here in this world as much as love of God and love of the other, that is. The martyrs, he says, won paradise through their blood, the ascetics through their ascetic life. Now you, my brethren who have children, the married people, how will you win paradise? By means of hospitality, by giving to your brothers who are poor, blind, and lame. The Christian needs two wings in order to soar upward and attain paradise: humility and love. Next, we go to a very notable person who, in my opinion, he's the one who started the neo-patristic synthesis, as we will find out. Saint Macarius Notaras. He was born in 1731 in Corinth. He was known as Michael Notaras, meaning Michael, his name. The Notaras are a very famous and well-known family. They were senators in the Eastern Roman Empire. He has two patriarchs of Jerusalem who are related to him, Dositheus II and Chrysanthos. We know Dositheus from the Council of Jerusalem of 1672, which was actually held in Bethlehem against the Calvinists. Michael was pious from his youth. He despised the world. He was very humble, very, very humble. Unfortunately, when he joined the Megaspilion monastery, the great cave, he was forcibly extracted from there by his father. It seems his father wanted him to be famous in the world, and so there was some tension there. Michael taught at schools in Corinth for free for 6 years, which probably offended his father even more. In 1765, Michael was popularly elected as Metropolitan of Corinth. He was tonsured a monk as Macarius, that's when he gained his new name, and consecrated at the age of 34. Macarius implemented sweeping reforms among the clergy in Corinth. If you were illiterate, you had to learn how to read and write. If you didn't know how to serve, you had to learn how to serve. If you didn't understand the faith to teach it to others, he gave catechism books for the clergy. If you are too old to serve, let others serve in your stead. In the early 1770s, there was an Orlov revolt, and the Russo-Turkish war started between the Russians and the Greeks. His family, the Notaras family, was accused of sedition. They had to flee to the Ionian Islands, and unfortunately, Macarius lost his Corinthian metropolitanate for good. However, he was granted to serve as bishop by Constantinople as long as he lived. He returned to Athos and then to Patmos. In Patmos, he established the All Saints Hermitage at Mount Cumana, and he always practiced a strict ascetic life. From Athos and Patmos, Saint Macarius collected and edited the writings of the Holy Fathers on prayer and the inner life. It was published in Venice in 1782 as the Philokalia. Macarius was pivotal in the Kollyvades movement that in 1783, he likes to be anonymous. He didn't want his name in any of the things that were published. On frequent and holy communion. And in 1793, when his father died, he burned all the promissory notes owed to his family. There were no banks in those days, so people owed people money. His father was owed money. He destroyed that and then settled in Chios, the island of Chios across from Smyrna, until his death in 1805. He spiritually heard the confessions and strengthened the new martyrs, the martyrs who were killed under the Turkish occupation of the Ottomans. Now, we have to know something in order to be knowledgeable. I'm not putting down Saint Nicodemus the Agorite, but we have to take both of them in tandem because they were contemporaries. Saint Macarius was a little bit his predecessor. We have to think of Saint Macarius as the compiler and the fundraiser. He secured funds for the books to be published, and Nicodemus served as the editor and the publisher. So many of the important books that appeared in the 18th century may have only Nicodemus's name, but actually, if Macarius did not collect, discover, and compile these books and give them to Nicodemus, Nicodemus would have nothing to edit, nothing to print, and no money to print it. So Macarius traveled extensively in the Aegean and on Mount Athos, discovering, collecting, compiling ancient manuscripts. He utilized his connections in order to raise money for the printing of these books. Saint Nicodemus, on the other hand, he was entrusted by Saint Macarius with the raw manuscript collections, and he meticulously edited, organized, and composed the prologues to these works, which I will mention soon, in addition to the Philokalia. So we have to think of them in tandem and not separately. The most important work is the Philokalia, which is the love of the beautiful, published in 1782 in Venice. It's a collection of writings, ascetic and contemplative texts on prayer and the spiritual life by various church fathers, spanning from the 4th to the 15th century. So in other words, if we didn't have Saint Macarius, we had no access to the Philokalia. The same thing is with concerning frequent communion of the Immaculate Mysteries, which was anonymously published, but Saint Macarius is the one who wrote it, challenges the pseudo-theology of that epoch in the 18th century, because people back then believed that Holy Communion is sufficient when participated only few times a year. A false theology developed because at most cases the clergy were not allowed to serve the divine liturgy under the Turks every Sunday. So people had assumed that it's okay to take communion 3 to 4 times a year. And this is the important aspect of the Kollyvades movement and Saint Macarius, that no, we should have liturgy every Sunday and we should take communion whenever we can. The Evergetinos is a collection of divinely uttered words and teachings of the Holy and God-bearing Fathers, sometimes subtitled as the Synagogy. It was Saint Macarius who compiled this 4-volume set, which we know it today as the Sayings of the Desert Fathers. It actually originated in the 11th century by a monk named Paul of the Evergetides monastery, which means the all benefactress, the monastery of the Theotokos, near Constantinople. It was published in 1783. It contains thousands of aphorisms, stories, and spiritual remedies drawn from hagiographies, the Apophthegmata, Patron, as well as works by Saint John Cassian, Saint Ephraim the Syriac, and Saint Isaac of Nineveh. It is therapeutic, a practical medical guide of the soul. Saint Macarius also composed a Christian apologia. The first edition was written by Saint Athanasius Parius, who wrote the life of Saint Macarius, a priest, in 1798. But the second edition, which appeared in Vienna in 1805, was composed by Saint Macarius. It's a robust defense of Orthodox Christianity, which targets rationalism, secularism, and anti-ecclesial ideas spreading specifically from the French Revolution, such as false freedom and false equality. It's a treatise against Western Enlightenment rationalism. You know, the logo of the French Revolution was liberté, égalité, fraternité, and basically Saint Macarius and others in the East thought that it was nonsense in the mind of the Orthodox Church. It's not God-driven, in other words. There's the Martyrologium, which is called Neon-Limonarian, which is spiritual, the new spiritual meadow. The first edition by St. Macarius appeared in 1799. It's a significant collection of Orthodox Christian hagiography of specifically 85 new martyrs executed for their faith by the Ottomans between 1492 and 1794. So when you are reading the Synaxarion, when you come across the term neo-martis, new martyr, under Turkokratia, it's referring to this sad epoch. The second edition was heavily expanded by Saint Nikephoros of Chios, who was a disciple of Saint Macarius and published in 1819 in Venice. So according to Saint Athanasius Parius, quote, Saint Macarius wrote many other books, most of which were published anonymously. This is how Saint Athanasius Parius describes Saint Macarius Notaras. Imitating the bee, he gathered together from many sources what was edifying and conducive to salvation, copying some accounts, translating others, seeking in every way to bring benefit and salvation to Christians. I love Father Christian. He did a wonderful presentation on Father Romanides. But unfortunately, Saint Macarius Notaras was actually the one who in the 18th century, he's the one who sparked the neo-patristic synthesis that Father John Romanides and Father George Florovsky talk about in the 20th century. This is an area that requires a lot of research, because a lot of what we know from Saint Simeon, the new theologian of the 10th century, Saint Gregory Palamas of the 14th century, Saint Mark Evgenikos of Ephesus, who refused to sign the Florence account of union in the 15th century, all of those were brought to light by Saint Macarius Notaras. This is a proof that he was so humble that he refused to have his name on anything that he compiled. This is the Synagogue, which is the short name for the Evergetinos, the sayings of the Desert Fathers. And the only proper name other than Pavlos of the Evergeti monastery is in the bottom, Ioannou Kana, John Canas. This is not a theologian, believe it or not. This was a donor, someone who paid for this book. I think he was either from Smyrna or Polyponicis. He's the donor who paid toward the book. Last but not least, is an interesting figure of the 18th century. Nikiforos Theotokis, his Greek name. Nikifor Theotoki is his Russian name. He was Greek, like the other two I spoke of. He was born in Corfu in 1731. He was a Greek scholar, a polymath, knowledgeable in many sciences, and a theologian at the same time. But unlike the negative examples that I brought before, although Nikiforos studied at Italian universities in Bologna and Padua, he was not influenced by Western thought. He was Orthodox. In 1748, he returned to Corfu and became a monk. 1754, he became a hieromonk. Like Saint Cosmas and Macarius, he was interested in educating the youth of his country. In 1758, he set up his own school in Corfu, and it was the first school to teach Greek, Italian literature, grammar, geography, rhetorics, physics, mathematics, and philosophy. He authored books on physics and mathematics while he was archbishop. So science is not an enemy of faith in Orthodox teaching. He published books on science and mathematics in Iași, in Romania. In 1765, he became the first preacher in Constantinople under Patriarch Samuel I Chatzizeris. And in 1776, he went to the Russian Empire. In 1779, he succeeded Evgenius Vulgaris, who was the teacher of Saint Cosmas, as the Archbishop of Slavyansk and Kherson, which is now in the Ukraine, which was headquartered in Poltava. In 1786, he was transferred to Astrakhan and Stavropol as Archbishop. He was instrumental Nikiforos Theotokis in healing the old believers' schism. On June 15th, 1792, he retired due to ill health. He moved to the Danilov monastery, becoming its abbot near Moscow. He died in 1800 and was buried there. Unfortunately, the evil Bolsheviks destroyed and obliterated that cemetery, that we don't know where Nikiforos, who is one of the Didaskalos Tougeno, one of the teachers of the Orthodox people, is laid to rest. So these are copies where his name is clearly indicated. On the left is a math book of geometry and arithmetics in Greek, and he wrote, also translated it to Slavonic in the Russian Empire. On the right, you have a book on physics. In the left, you have an important book that Nikiforos composed. It is called in Greek Kyriakodromion. In Greek, it was 4 volumes, and it consisted of exegeting the gospel and epistle lessons for all the Sundays of the year. And earlier I said, unless you know Arabic or Greek or Russian or Slavonic, you're not going to be familiar with him, because this Kyriakodromion in full exists only in Greek and Slavonic, and it was translated in 1898 in Jerusalem to Arabic. The Serbian Orthodox Church in Pech gives a lot of credit to Nikiforos Theotokis. As you can see on the right, his name is in the middle, because he resuscitated the Greek works of our father, Saint Isaac of Nineveh, which in the 9th century was translated to Greek at the Saint Sava Monastery in the Holy Land. So we rely on this a lot. It is a foundational translation by Nikiforos Theotokis. Last but not least, the Evergetinos is translated to Arabic, which has been, admittedly, it has been my companion in the years of my priesthood. This is in 2 volumes. This is the epistles translated. You could see the name Nikiforo Theotoki here, and this is the one on the Gospels. The title was changed in Arabic to say Bahjatul Fuad fi Tafsir Anajil wa Rasail Ahad, which means the joy of the heart in expositing and interpreting the Gospels and the epistles of Sundays. And thank you for your patience, and this is my presentation.